uh,
Excuse me.
get started, and let's open with a sneeze and a word of prayer. Dear Lord, we come before you today humbly acknowledging that we need your strength and your help in understanding your word and all the problems that we look at and will look at this coming hour. So we ask for your help in Jesus' name. Amen. Anyway, chapter 6 is on sort of towards the bottom of the second page, and we might get started by reading a couple of quotes. The chapter talks about all the different stuff that people tell themselves that to convince themselves that they're not racists when sometimes they are. And a lot of these don't apply, I think, or at least didn't ring true, I guess, with me. But anyway, first couple of paragraphs here, a quote from her, the start of the chapter. Almost everywhere you turn, you can find someone giving you a reason why it's totally okay to deny that racism exists, to avoid acknowledging our own racist behavior, and to pretend everything is fine. But everything is not fine. People are suffering. If we are truly good, we will do the hard work of deconstructing these paradoxical truths, untangling the complexity, and changing the embedded structures that are causing harm. For those of us who claim to follow Jesus, I believe this becomes even more important because our faith is one of deep self-reflection and ultimately repentance. So anyway, the first one is that Black people owned slaves, and this was a new one for me. Wasn't aware they owned slaves, but it was not very common at all, really. There were few slaves that Blacks owned, and often they owned just one, and often it was a wife that had been freed, but never officially given her freedom. So anyway, I'm not sure why, but the subject of reparations came up in this section. Any thoughts on that? It's a pretty, divisive, perhaps, idea. Do we owe former slaves? Former people whose land we've stolen, sort of.
Well, if you think about Pastor Matt's trip to Alaska, that was all about reparations.
Right.
That the Presbyterian Church had, with racial intent, closed a congregation in Juneau. And the reparations were not given to individual people, but to organizations that further the cultural diversity, the cultural acceptance, the language of the Haida people, mostly the Haida. And we now are working with a group of Alaskans to do reparations with the damage that was done to families with the boarding school issues. There were 3 in Southeast Alaska that were owned and operated by the Presbyterian Church. And the children have never been found. It's a long story. I could certainly give you books to read if you were interested.
But these were orphans and not.
No, they were not orphans. They were kidnapped.
Taken from them.
Yeah. And so reparations is in place. The reparations will not be monetary. The reparations, we hope, will be identifying where those children ended up. They were adopted throughout the United States. The government was a part of the whole process. They were the ones that were doing the kidnapping of the children. We know that there was a mental health facility in Portland, Oregon, where 8,000 infants from Alaska were were kidnapped, taken there, and were cremated alive. So the Presbyterian Church has a strong history of working towards reparations. And I'm really happy that I get to be a part of that team.
What was the purpose of kidnapping them?
The United States government did not want Native Americans to act like Native Americans, dress like Native Americans, live like Native Americans. Their hope was that if they took the children, the whole goal was to teach them how to be white.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Their names were changed. Their identity was changed in every way, the clothes they wore, the kind of food, the language, everything was designed to make them white.
But it wasn't simply the government, it was the government and the church.
And the churches.
That was,
Babies.
that was involved.
But I think it's startling that the government was the one that was behind this, but they used the churches as their tool.
There's if any of you have Hulu, there's something called the 1619 Project, which is like a 6-episode series, but it's off of a book, where it goes through how African Americans have contributed to American culture, and it kind of goes through a bunch of different topical areas. And the last one is on reparations, and just talking about the sheer numbers of economically how much money slavery provided for the United States. And I mean, just not aside from just like having land taken from people, but just the sheer number of basically free labor.
Right.
It's pretty staggering.
But they calculated the number somewhere in the trillions.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty, but it's a really well done, if you want something that's kind of visual, so you don't have to, I haven't read the book, but I think it's a well done.
It does a good job of sort of laying out the case for reparations, I think, in a pretty fair way. And it lays out some of the roadblocks that we'll encounter if kind of pursuing that as well. I mean, it's tricky because reparations, it's not just a monetary thing. I mean, I don't know if we could pay back the amount of money that we owe to families of slaves who are still here in the United States. But there's this concept called restorative justice that's really important with this. And reparations is a part of that. It's the idea that the reason reparations is a piece of this conversation is because all of those Black families who are descended from slaves, they were not allowed to build up wealth the same way white families were. And if you take a look at if their labor had been fairly compensated, they would have been able to build up wealth in a way that would have allowed them to progress further in sort of developing their way into the middle class and potentially even higher than the middle class. And it's thinking about how a lot of those families were really stuck in a cycle of poverty because of those major setbacks. Does that make sense? And so when you think about reparations, it's not just here's a check, it's also what barriers have been put in your way to keep you from being successful, what things were taken from you, what opportunities were taken from you, how do we fix that? And how do we smooth the path for you to move forward and develop the same way white families had the opportunity to develop? Does that make sense?
The issue though isn't simply Black, it's also Native American and
Right.
Alaska.
Well, and it also isn't just money. The psychological damage done to the families that
Right.
we've been talking with is horrendous. It's generational.
Right.
These kids were lost in the 50s. And so third generations are still feeling the trauma of that.
Right.
And I'm sure that the slaves,
Yes.
the Blacks are still feeling the trauma of family members having been slaves.
Yeah. And in sociology, they call that the concept of historical trauma.
Yeah.
Right.
What do you feel?
Well, I think, so I went through, excuse me, training quite a few years ago about generational trauma.
Mhm.
And at that time, I didn't understand it. I'm like, why are we learning this? And I was like, so then a couple of years later, I thought about it again, and I can see it, you know, on the reservation, that, my mom told me this, that, I said, Mom, why aren't you speaking the Makah language? And, because her dad spoke 3 languages, and she said, well, because he was, they call it scoop and sweep, taken from the reservation, had to go to a boarding school, and he wasn't allowed
Wow.
to speak the languages.
Mhm.
And because, and then if he did, he got, you know, beaten. And he didn't want that to happen to her. So he wouldn't speak it. So she just, you know, knew words like I do. So I can see the generational trauma, you know, within the reservation. I don't know about the Black communities, but I'm thinking that it's probably the same. And I think the only way that I can see it advancing past that is to get the people the help that they need, because, you know, they're kind of stuck.
Mhm.
And unless they want help, they just stay in that mode. So I think hearing this and watching it is really helpful, because a lot of times growing up, I thought, they're prejudiced. And I would get upset and I wouldn't go there.
Mhm.
And then later on, I started thinking, okay, maybe they're just having a bad day. And I don't think that they're being prejudiced. So now I can kind of think, okay, they're having a bad day. They are being prejudiced.
Right.
And it takes me a lot to say something. Usually I'll say, yeah, I'll just say it out loud. Yeah, you're not having a good day, or, yeah. One time I was pretty upset and I'm like, yeah, if it wasn't for the color of my skin, I'm sure I'd be getting the help I need right now.
Mhm.
And it seems like that I need to learn how to say it,
Mhm.
you know, because I don't see it stopping soon, I guess.
Well, at the very end of the chapter, I believe it's this chapter, you know, it encourages us all to speak out when we hear prejudice. And it's not necessarily easy to do. It's easier not to do it. It's just
It is, but the way that I see it is, if I'm not gonna say anything, then, you know, I need to teach my kids how to say something, because I need to teach. So that's the conclusion I came to, and that's where I'm kind of stuck right now, is how can I say this in a nice way? You're not being nice right now.
I mean, you can say it in a mean way and we can then figure out a nice way later. It's okay. But
And there will be
Yeah.
relief on the people you're talking to,
Mhm.
that somebody, oh my gosh, it is a topic we can talk about.
yes,
Yeah, and I think the more we talk about it, probably the
Yeah,
more upfront it will be.
exactly.
And I think some people are just ignorant to things. too.
Yeah.
It's not that they're being mean, they just don't know.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and that starts on a personal level, but it obviously
Yeah, oh,
is
yeah.
corporate as well. And just look at things that have happened within the last year. I mean, affirmative action is basically for college admittance has basically been gotten rid of at this point. Except for the military academies, because they realize it's important to have people of color in leadership roles in the military, because there are so many people of color in the military, which is quite interesting to me.
Yeah.
So this idea that, and it'll go, and I know you're in it later in here, it talks about that, but
Mhm.
like, it's done. We fixed it. We fixed all the things that we messed up. And so now we can move on. And there's an idea of that. And I think it's important for people to share what's actually going on in their lives and their families' lives when this happens, so that people understand that this isn't an open and closed case. Like, this isn't like something got fixed and now we can just forget about it.
Mhm.
on the second page, there's a statistic from 2016, which is a little bit old, hasn't changed much. Black families have a net worth of $13,000 plus, and white families have an average net worth of $142,000.
Right.
That's huge, a huge difference. And can we make up for that and give every Black family $100,000? I don't think that's gonna happen. Maybe we should, but I don't see it.
I think though,
Yeah.
just acknowledging and saying that we need to repent, if it ends simply with those words, I don't think it means anything.
Right.
There has to be something more, and I can't even begin to imagine. I mean, when we're talking about Black, yes, and Indigenous, American, yeah, it's just, the figures are so staggering. So it has to be something even more than simply money, but that's important.
Well, today we still see a lot of scapegoating, I would call it, against brown people at our southern border especially.
Oh my goodness, yes.
Sure.
Wow.
What gets me is these sorts of statistics are set by educated people. You would think that they would understand more completely what should be done. I mean, like these dollar figures here, they're way out of balance, obviously.
Way out.
And out of that whole, I mean, there must have been at least a committee of people that determined, what that was going to be. And they're obviously educated people. They wouldn't be there if they weren't. How could it end up like this?
Structural racism.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. But
Yeah.
Paul, is your sense that,
our education system is failing.
is your sense that, is this sort of tongue in cheek, the dollar amount?
No, so how that's determined is just by naturalistic observation. You just look at what's out there.
But isn't it way bigger than the dollar amount?
It's way more than just the dollar. The dollar amount is just an easily observable number. And so in the social sciences in particular, especially in psychology, when we look at numbers like this, there is a recognition that got that way because of what Jim's bringing up. There's something else causing this.
Right.
And so when you're touching on the education system being broken, it works for white people who can send their kids to expensive schools.
Right.
And it works for middle-class white folks. It works for Black families who are in areas where the schools are funded well. But for the rest of the country, we're actively trying to defund education for whatever reason, I don't understand. And as we're doing that, it ends up hurting a lot of Black families, Indigenous families, Latin American families in areas where they're trying to carve out and basically dismantle the public school system. So that removes easy access to the middle class and removes easy access to higher education for a lot of people. And for a long time, higher education was an equalizer that allowed access for people from lower classes into the middle class. But we're actively trying to dismantle it. It's not just that, it's also access to healthcare that predicts this, right? So it's also access to, I mean, gosh, we were watching a TV show last night and there was this really interesting thing where there was a character who had grown up, I think I couldn't tell if he was from Cuba or if he was from where? Puerto Rico. So when he was applying for jobs, he would send in 2 applications with the exact same stuff. One with his real name, Miguel Ferreira, and the other application with an English name, Michael Rivers, the same phone numbers on it. And he would get phone calls for Michael, but not for Miguel. And then people were surprised when he would go in and interview, right? So there's still, because of structural racism and because of the fact that society simply set up for people who look like me and look like you and not for people who don't look like us, that it results in exactly this happening. And that's also where the other, what was I saying earlier about reparations? That's where that concept of restorative justice comes into play, because it's not just, like Stan was saying, it's not just dismantling or making these numbers equivalent. It's making how we get to the numbers equivalent, so that when you have someone who is from a BIPOC community, they have the actual same equal opportunities that I do. But that's not what's happening right now, right? And this is just, this is a symptom. of the infection. So like with a cold, like you have a sore throat or a sneeze or a cough, this is just the cough, this is the sore throat, this is the sneeze, right? The actual virus is what needs to be addressed. Does that help answer your question? Yes.
Yeah,
Okay, in a long-winded sort of way.
I just thought maybe it was a parable.
No, it's just, it's an indicator.
Yeah.
It's a symptom, and there has been, I mean, if any of y'all take classes at the college at some point, if you wanna audit one of my courses, I am teaching social psychology in the spring, just to get a little plug for that. But we do address this stuff in depth in sociology and in psychology, because this is one of the big things that we really wrestle with is, okay, this exists. What on earth are we gonna do about this? How do we help? Right?
Well, and kind of the bottom line fear, I mean, that's the bottom line, racism in my mind, it's a fear of the unknown, it's a fear of having, if you make those steps to try to make things equal, am I gonna have to give up things in order to do that? You know, all these little fears that kind of go hand in hand, along with the process of going to where it should be going.
Fear is definitely an ingredient, but I would say greed played a bigger role in the origin of this. But if you look at, while fear is a facet of it, based off of everything that I have learned, not just doing DEI work, but also as a psychologist, it is a very complicated problem, and there's no easy way to sum it up. Whatever this is, it isn't simple.
To me, greed is based out of fear.
Fear of losing things. Well, and it's not just greed for stuff, but also I would say power plays a huge role in this.
But
So
you are addressing this in your college classes.
Oh, yeah.
Psych classes. Okay, well, see,
Oh,
when
yeah.
I was in college, I don't think it was at all. It should have been an ed psych.
DEI, well, so I have an entire chapter when I teach social psychology where I teach them about in-group out-group bias and prejudice and stereotypes, and we talk about how those things work and how they affect us. And then professors spend time digging into the mechanics of this. I look at the actual psychological construct of what prejudice is. Sociology analyzes the social aspects of it. History kind of explores the history of it, right? But everybody attacks it from different angles because of the complexity of it.
There's different kinds of biases are getting in there.
Yeah, I talk about biases and heuristics and stereotypes, and really, if I'm just gonna dip a toe into my curriculum here, just very briefly. There are these things called schemas. They are these cognitive shortcuts that we all make. So like, what do you expect at a birthday party, right? That you're probably gonna have somebody giving presents, or maybe there's gonna be cake, and if it's a child's birthday party, maybe clowns in a balloon. If it's a 21st birthday party, there's probably gonna be drinking, booze involved, and some bad decisions. So those are all part of your schema that you construct for those events, right? That's a set of expectations that helps you quickly get a handle on your experiences. So stereotypes are a special kind of schema applied to people, because the way you deal with people is your brain deals with people the same way it deals with like salad forks or kids' birthday parties. You don't really treat people different than your brain treats objects, which is kind of a feature of our evolution that helps us save time, but it has a significant social side effect. Stereotypes, when they continue to develop into the point where you're treating people differently, those become prejudices. And they're fueled by this thing called in-group, out-group bias, which is the idea that you like people who are like you. Right? You and I have a lot of similar experiences, right? Because we look a certain way. But people who aren't like you, you out-group. And you treat them as less human, and you treat them as more dangerous, and you treat them as inferior. And we believe we evolved this because it makes it easier to kill people. Because in the environment where we evolved it, it was easier. Well, if you were in competition with a tribe for resources, it would be easier if you could kill them. And the group that was more likely to reach for murder as a solution got those resources. Does that make sense? And so because we evolved that way and we kept that, and it hasn't been selected against an evolutionary theory, it sticks around. And it's still software that we are all running in our heads, and it fuels a lot of this stuff. And that's the way that we address it in psychology. Does that help a little bit?
Sure.
Good.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, all we have to do is label somebody a terrorist.
Right. Yeah, it's very
Or any
very
other
easy.
thing that we don't like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It runs the world.
Well,
It's titled.
if you look at I'm not trying to push buttons here, but if you do look at the current political dialogue, you can see in-group out-group bias in
Oh,
action.
heavens.
Like, because depending on what side you're on, you demonize the other side,
Mhm.
right? And that's out-group bias doing its job.
Yeah.
Right, like when settlers were moving their way through and displacing indigenous populations, did they treat them as equals? No, and they allowed their out-group bias to be, because it makes it easier to move them out of your domain of empathy. And when that happens, it's easier to abduct people and put them in boarding schools, right? They can just. But I'm a dog back, I'm just
Jim
getting
mentioned this,
frustrated.
I think, doesn't economics play
A huge role,
into this?
right, because
Every level?
racism was invented to support the slave trade. And it was invented to make it easier to treat people as inferior as commodities. And it was invented to basically support greed. I mean, the root sin behind all of this is greed. That's really where this started. Because people wanted cheap sugar and cheap tea and cheap molasses. And we still do this today. I mean, if you really want to go down a rabbit hole, research where your clothes were made.
I was gonna say.
Yeah.
So what does social science say about deconstructing those, that
That it's,
in-group, out-group
Sure.
bias?
so
I mean, that kind of gets sort of Jim was saying.
talking about it is just the first step. But this is also another important part of the lecture cycle that I do on this. We have a lot of research that shows that ignorance is not the way to deal with this. So, and Andrew actually mentioned that briefly about people just being ignorant. We call that the ignorance hypothesis, and just educating people by itself doesn't work. The things that do work are cooperating towards common goals. So working together and recognizing that we all share certain things in common, and also identifying what function prejudice serves. Because it gives people who have prejudices and people who are racist, they're getting something out of it. Identifying the function that it serves and then finding a way to supplement it or replace it with something else is another really effective way to do it. And then putting yourself in the shoes of people that you have outgrown, forcing the empathy function to kick into gear helps a lot. If you have questions about that, talk to me. Yeah.
Cross-cultural experiences, is that?
That can help broaden views, but usually it's preying on or operating on the empathy mechanism, because you're seeing how other people have lived, right? So I can talk about that more later, but.
Well, have they tried to utilize the biases that occur within a culture in order to show people how that even gets in the way of proper treatment of others, and it going outside of the group after just having that discussion and seeing where that goes?
I would strongly recommend looking up the Robbers Cave experiment, where you can send me an email and I can send you a copy of the report written on that. It basically was an experiment that was designed to create in-group out-group bias in a group of people who didn't have it, and then it actively tried to dismantle it with a variety of different tools to see what worked. So they explored that, and there's been other work that's been done. I mean, the fact of the matter is we don't know we have biases. They're completely and totally invisible to us.
Yeah.
But when we talk about them and we start doing the work that we're doing in here right now by addressing them, that's step one. Step two is at some point in your life, it's going to happen, and your in-group out-group bias is going to kick in, and it's going to start doing its thing. And that moment where you go, oh my gosh, this is in-group out-group bias, I am part of the problem. That's the next step, and then actively taking steps to try to kind of go against it, or just recognize that it's there and it's blinding you to the humanity of another person. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
What was the name of the study?
Robbers Cave experiment. If any of y'all want a copy of it, I mean, I give it out to all of my InterPsych students for free. I'd be happy to email you a copy of the report that was written on it. It's a fascinating read. It's also, I think, pretty easily available. If you do a Google Scholar search, you should be able to find a copy of it. Robbers Cave, like Robbers Cave State Park in Oklahoma.
There's a word you're using that I'm not hearing. In-group, something.
In-group bias
Oh,
and
in-group.
out-group bias, right?
Okay, thank you.
You know,
Yeah, I
this-
wrote it down. I just wasn't hearing much,
Sure, in-group.
yeah. And out-group.
You know, this has really profound implications for how we think about conversion.
Yeah,
I mean, think about the sermon this morning and Paul's experience and what that did in terms of Paul's understanding of an outgroup, you know,
Mhm.
and maybe how limited we've kind of looked at the concept of conversion. Me and Jesus, we're going to heaven, all is well in the world. And I think, you know, there's a lot of work to be done in the way we even understand our faith and what it means to be a child of God,
Mhm.
you know, to hear. So, ouch.
yeah.
Well, I think we need to move on. I encourage you to look through.
I'm sorry,
Yes, but I have-
I really didn't mean to talk so much. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
I'm sorry, Lori.
It's Sarah's turn. And,
It's
you
like,
know,
I'm trying to dismantle my male privilege, but I'm doing a terrible job.
If if you have the book, by all means, read it and maybe get a copy if you don't have it. But this is a bit of an outline for that chapter anyway. So Sarah, why don't you take it away with the next chapter?
So this actually just kind of flows quite well, not necessarily from where the chapter went, but from where you all went. So good job. I will get you all a handout with some of these terms on it next week. Our printer ink died and we could not get another ribbon before today. So it will come
Ribbon?
next week
Not a ribbon.
or whatever.
No, it's a ribbon.
No.
I don't know. That is- he does those things, not me. Okay.
Laser printers are
What
weird.
century are we in?
It's
I
a,
don't
it's a
know.
laser printer and no, it wasn't a ribbon, it was toner.
Sorry.
I feel better.
Toner. I'm a child of the 90s. Okay. So there's some terms, just to kind of define, and then we're gonna go into a little bit of like how white people view the world around them and how people of color have to then live within that set of expectations. So the term that she defines in the next chapter is the social contract. So a social contract is an unspoken agreement in which everyone agrees to live by certain rules and to expect certain benefits and securities in return. So kind of I give something up, but I know I'm going to get something back.
It's a societal schema.
Exactly. And so she breaks it down into some different categories. The first is the political contract, which is giving authority to the government in return for services of some sort. So can you guys give some examples of what that would be?
Pay your taxes.
And then we, right,
Get roads.
Mm.
And police.
yeah. Anything else?
People who fill in all of our sinkholes. Of which there are now many.
Yeah,
Another aspect of the social contract she talked about was the moral contract, which is the expectations we have in society about what's right and what's wrong, or maybe what's appropriate and not appropriate. Anybody have any examples of that are just kind of expected things that we as Americans kind of, or white Americans, I guess, maybe, kind of expect as far as how we interact with people around us?
well, just how men are to treat women
Mhm.
and how men are to treat children
Mhm.
and how it differs a little bit from women doing those same things.
Oh, yeah.
There are, different expectations there.
Mhm.
How about a sense of tidiness and personal hygiene, which drives our reaction to homeless people?
Mhm.
Very good.
Yeah,
Maybe personal space. If you get too close to start talking to someone and you're an American, it's kind of like, what are you doing in my bubble?
like, you move away from her, but you're getting closer to her.
I know, I'm trying, so I'm actually doing it right now. I'm navigating.
You're trying to make a choice
I'm
here.
trying to balance my personal bubble.
And then those that wear uniforms versus those that don't.
Mhm. And just things like, don't murder another person. That's kind of
Yeah.
an expected understanding in our society, right? Not just because the law says so, but because we all agree that that's not a good thing, right?
Most of
I'm
us
not
agree.
sure anymore.
Well,
Yeah, it's not all of us.
Appropriate label, you
Yes.
can get away with it by defending your home.
so then to kind of
Stand your ground.
to kind of pull another layer into that, then she goes into a term called the racial contract. It's a societal agreement that separates and subordinates non-whites from whites. The definition that she gave was from an author named Charles W. Mills. Basically said that all white people are beneficiaries of this racial contract, even if they don't necessarily agree or desire to be a part of it, which I thought was interesting. Good way to think about it. And then to take that even one step further, then what she called the savage construct, which is not just that there's a white expectation and people need to live up to it, but that anyone else who is not here is somewhat uncivilized or needs to be cared for or told how to do things the right way, because the level of whiteness is the gold standard for what everyone else has to live up to. So those are kind of just some basic definitions. Do you guys have any questions about that before we move into the actual discussion part? Okay. So what is a white space? If you hear the term white space, what does that bring up to you?
Well, it's the areas in which the whites control.
Mm-hmm. And what ways would you say that white people exact control on the space that they're in?
I'd say we light it up. I was on the south side of Chicago one time, got lost, and it was unbelievably dark, very few street lamps, and I crossed a certain arterial, and I knew I was home.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought of that. Interesting.
When I was just a kid, the family was in the car, my dad was driving, we were going through the Haight-Ashbury district. And we didn't realize it was going to be happening, but the riots had begun. We had black people on the hood of the car jumping up and down and trying to get into the doors. And my dad had to just be very careful about how he got out of that situation. We were, of course, driving a Lincoln. So made it easy for us to be a target.
When we talked a minute ago about some of the social expectations, right? The things like hygiene and things like that we talked about that are kind of important to American culture. How would that inform these spaces?
Well, just around holidays for one. How we view holidays differently. I think maybe partially influenced by some of that.
Do you mean like how we dress in a white space versus?
I was just thinking more like attitude and interaction. So like what Andrea talked about last week, or maybe it wasn't Andrea, maybe it was somebody. Anyway, we were talking about in a classroom how someone was asking, it was Pam. Someone was asking the child to do something and their reaction was a literal reaction, not understanding the context, and therefore the reaction was different. Who determined what the proper interaction was?
So
the white teacher, right?
So it's the language that we use
It can be.
that also helps or defines it.
Mhm.
Or at least having the same understanding of the definitions of words.
Right.
Which is language, yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that's. I mean, just because we change the way we say what we're trying to say doesn't really cover having the same definition, understanding of definitions either. I mean, just because we change the way we say it, that doesn't mean they're gonna.
I'm not sure if I
I
have.
thought, I think that I think you're still saying the same thing though.
I
Well,
think so.
is it, okay.
I think, but I'm not sure.
Brenda, did you have something?
I kind of lost it.
Okay.
So it was, no, I was thinking it's the tone too. It's not just the
Oh.
vocabulary, it's the tone and how it's said,
Right.
because in our household, voices weren't raised. And if they were, we knew that we were in deep trouble. We gotta get out of the way or get moving. So, and then when I heard yelling and the different tone, I'm like, whoa, they're mad, and I kind of cowered back, but, you know, I think it is, and especially in the school system, if a teacher raises their voice, I know that a native would like get scared. And vocabulary is different, because I know that, teachers would say, use your school language. And I didn't know any different. That ain't a word. You know, go back to slang. So there is a barrier.
Even, I just kind of thought, in the church setting, like if you think about denominations that are predominantly out of white historical culture, just that's how the denomination developed. If we had a couple of people that came in from, say, like a Black AME background, and the way that they worship is different, right? There's a lot of people there's not an order. We love our order and everything being where it is, right? Because that's what Presbyterians like, is order. And then you may have someone come in that worships very differently, and how would we react to that, right? Because we've created this space with these rules, and all of a sudden someone comes in and acts differently. How does that look like? How do people react, right?
Yeah.
Maybe how we know we should react versus how we react without thinking, right? Because would we first think, oh man, that's disruptive, even though in our heads we know that that's not how we should react, right?
And the same thing happens for us when we go into a new situation, whether it's a church or whatever. We kind of hang back a little bit until we get the sense of the room.
Okay.
You have to take the radar pulse.
Yeah.
What's going on,
Yeah.
So if you envision a person, just a blanket person who is successful and morally good, what would you envision them dressing like? What expectations do you have for a person who's kind of your typical good person? What do they look like?
Like a robe with a sash.
Okay, maybe not that good. Human good.
Be well groomed.
Mhm,
Yeah. Neat, clean.
mhm. Expectation of maintaining facial hair, or what their hair would look like, right?
Whether they're male or female.
Well,
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
that could be included too.
yeah.
I'm sorry, I've seen all kinds.
No, that's not what you were saying. Okay, good.
So just thinking about things like, if you thought about that kind of person, you know, what type of clothing do they wear? What kind of jewelry do they wear? What kind of shoes do they wear? Like, what do we associate with being a good and successful person in American culture, right? We kind of have this vision in our heads.
Well, generally what we wear ourselves is pretty close to what we expect ordinarily.
Because of the social contract, right?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm not sure, but I'm impressed by someone with a suit and tie, even though I don't anymore wear one.
Yeah.
Pretty much. I mean, there's a certain,
Oh, I know. I
difference
said
there
just generally.
between how people dress. Successful people
Dress
wear
for
coats and ties and robes and things.
Well, you gotta look at what the definition of successful is too.
Well, I'm looking at this just from a very surfacey level, not like,
Okay.
you know, because I know where you're going, and
Yeah.
I agree with that, but just as as a society, how we would react to that,
Yeah.
right?
Well, that scenario does change, wouldn't you say though, too? Informality in dress as considered professional, but now there's kind of like an elite, the suits,
They're
wander
uppity.
around, which we don't aspire to necessarily. We kind of almost suspect that. They might be political, they might be corporate, they might be,
Yeah.
and so we opt for a more kind of informal, casual.
I mean, think about weddings or funerals, and people wear whatever, they, from jeans to nice.
I was so proud of my first three-piece suit, you know, I mean, I arrived when I got home. I haven't seen one of those in 40 years.
Right.
I have one.
So I did this test, kind of just for myself. I went downtown to shop and the store's no longer there. And I wore my sweats and sweatshirt and kind of felt grubby that day anyway, but. And I went in and I was, nobody else, you know, offered help or anything or assistance. I was kind of avoided, but I felt I was being watched. So then the next week I'm gonna go there again, but I'm going to wear my Sunday best and I was treated differently.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Got money.
You know, it's interesting because Stan thinks this is stupid, but I noticed that Nikki Haley was wearing jeans at her events, and I thought, how unusual. Mostly the candidates for president would be dressed up, and she was appearing in many of the events. See, they all think it's stupid too.
That was in South Dakota and New Hampshire in the winter.
Well, in Iowa, in that case.
Yeah, that's right, Iowa.
It
In the winter.
In the winter.
usually wouldn't matter. They
Why?
would not wear jeans. And sweatshirt, but it was nice. It had a big star on it. Okay, see, I'm in minority this time.
No, probably the majority.
So the reverse of that then, what are some styles of dress or ways of appearance that would make you uncomfortable around someone or maybe even fearful of someone?
I used to be afraid of people. Now we were walking in Seattle. I was with my brother and husband, and I'm like, hey, how are you? Hi, what's going on? And, you know, just saying hi to everybody. And my brother pulled me aside, he goes, you can't do that here. And I go, well, you know, I just want to say hi to everybody, so.
I think a lot of people with piercings and tattoos are turn off to a lot of people. Or apprehensive, like,
Brings question marks up in the brain.
yeah.
Depends a little too on what the tattoos are. You know, if it's a swastika, that makes a big difference.
Mine's a wheel.
Some of them could be really artsy.
Or Satanist type stuff. Or whatever.
Yeah, I'm just saying that with people.
With a lot of metal. A lot of metal and.
Oh,
Yeah.
here's
Or a ring full of keys.
I still respond
I
to
feel called out.
men with shaved heads.
Men with shaved heads.
Again,
I have a lot of keys.
I respond not positively to men with shaved heads.
oh,
That sets off a whole series of stereotypes for me that I just have to rein in. You know, from jacked up pickups and rifles and baseball caps. Down home Alabama or something, I don't know. Yeah, if they have a uniform, a little less suspect, but kind of thinking, they're incognito.
This is a good time, I think, to share. We got permission from this individual to share. Paul and I have a friend named Ed Johnson, who is a high school classmate of Paul's and has been a friend over the years. And Ed is Black, and he did a lot of work prior to the pandemic, after the incidences in the St. Louis area, about just coming out with some of his stories about what's happened to him, and shared a lot on Facebook, which was really formative for me, having grown up in a very white area and just didn't have any understanding. And anyone who meets Ed, like, everyone loves Ed. He is just the most lovely human being.
Can I give a little background on him?
You can.
So, I mean, Ed experienced homelessness during high school, and he, after graduating, he enlisted in the Oklahoma National Guard. He has done 4 tours, 1 in Egypt prior to 9/11, post 9/11, I think it was, 2 in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, during some really intense fighting. He has a Bronze Star. He went from being an enlisted, like he was a sergeant and like on the enlisted side of the military, he did the very hard to do thing of transitioning from being enlisted to the officer track. He, on next Sunday, is getting promoted to captain, which is a phenomenal thing to have done. I mean, he's not just a soldier, he is a minted bona fide war hero. And he would never, could you say that in front of him, he would get really embarrassed and say, no, I'm not,
Yeah.
because he's also extremely self-deprecating.
Yeah.
He spent a lot of time sort of in between 2 families. He has sort of an adopted white family and a biological black family. And he worked for a really long time for the Oklahoma Highway Patrol as an officer. So he has spent a lot of time floating in between different worlds and seeing how different people react. This story comes specifically from his experience. You want me to tell it, or would you
Go
like to
ahead.
tell it? Okay, so he went into the OHP, Oklahoma Highway Patrol office one day to pick up his paycheck. That day, he was wearing his sweats and he had a hoodie and it was cold outside.
And he's bald.
And he's bald, so he pulled the hoodie up around his head, like you do, because cold.
Sure.
They pulled guns on him and started shouting at him, telling him, show your hands, who are you? And he had to very quickly pull his hood down and say, it's me, I work here, you know me. The officers saw 2 variables when he walked into the door, black man, hoodie, and drew firearms on him when he just came in to pick up his paycheck. And these were people he had been working with for years. Take it from there.
So I think the thing I wanted us to think about, because I think it helps kind of get into our understanding of appearance and where our minds go. Just to ask the question, if Ed had been a 5'10" Asian man in casual dress, what would the reaction have been?
No reaction, probably.
Or maybe like, how can I help you?
Okay.
You know? What if Ed had been a 5'7" Hispanic man with tattoos?
Ooh,
And you're talking about in Oklahoma.
that's
Yes.
correct.
Yeah.
That is a variable here, so.
A huge variable. I think even for the other Asian might be different.
Speaking from experience, again, one of my Asian friends was pulled over in my neighborhood and harassed by police. Yes, that would have been
What neighborhood, where?
Midtown Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Oh, okay.
And then the one that kind of came to my mind that I was mulling around, and this goes off of Wayne's thought there. What if Ed had been a 6-foot-tall white man with a t-shirt that said, don't tread on me, and was carrying a handgun in a state that allows open carry and walked into the Oklahoma Highway Patrol?
Come on in, brother.
White privilege.
So just kind of thinking about how that would play a role. And I'm not saying this specifically in the case only of walking into a police station, but just how people in general would react to some of those different things, right? So because it does extend beyond that, does anyone know or have heard of the term of being a Karen? And do you know what a Karen is?
Spell
Karen.
it.
Oh,
Like your sister's name, like her sister's name.
A Karen, though, is
Is that like
a white lady who demands, I want to say respect, but not even that, demands her way.
difficult person?
A very difficult person.
and that is probably what it's come to be more now.
Yeah.
It actually stemmed from specifically white men or white women interacting in that way with around Black men.
Oh.
So the term, we looked it up, the term actually was starting to be used more regularly after the bird watching incident. Do you guys
Oh,
remember
yeah.
the bird watching incident?
Yeah.
There was a man in Central Park who was Black and was bird watching. And a white woman called the cops on him because he was in the public park looking at birds with binoculars. And so that's kind of where it started. And then I think you're right. I think it's expanded onto just demanding things they think they deserve regardless of who
But
they're
it's
directing it
often
at.
still related to blacks
Right.
Yes.
and Hispanic and.
Yes.
And being male.
I think I think male, but also I think it is extends sometimes to black women and.
Yeah,
working
I
class as
think
well,
we can go
for
that
sure.
way.
Mhm.
Yeah, like what Michelle Obama was accused of, or as an angry black woman.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So, we did not have a transition between that and the next.
So what are snowflakes?
Yeah, that's a
Depends
white
on who you
person
ask.
So, yeah, you usually hear the term snowflake used by people on the right talking about people who complain more on the left. So it's a slam against liberals more often
Yeah.
than not.
That's what I kind of.
Sort of like the term social justice warrior or bleeding heart, those are usually lobbed at liberals to try to denigrate them in some way.
Yeah, I think I've been called that one.
So both in the instances where we're talking about Ed's interaction with the police and also just this bird watcher's interaction with the Karen, I don't even remember her name.
No. Might have been Karen, or no.
It paints a picture, and you could understand perhaps why people of color would feel different when they're acting in these white spaces, right? Why they have to adjust the way they speak, adjust the way they act, and have different assumptions of what's going to happen in those spaces, with the rest of us just walking in there and not really even thinking about what we're doing, right? And that kind of tails into a little bit what we're going to get into next week, and I wanted to just kind of finish up with this part of it. There's a quote in the book. It says, "When it comes to power and its abuses, these kinds of stories are myriad and frustrating for their obvious racist tendencies. But for the BIPOC community, they can become nothing short of deadly. For most of us, the police are the first and for white people, often the only experience with the criminal justice system. Most middle-class white people tend to have a healthy respect for police and to see them as characters in a Norman Rockwell painting in which the friendly beat officer tips his hat and buys the lost kid an ice cream cone. The BIPOC community does not have the same experience." And then to finish our time, we're just gonna let Ed finish our time. He wrote an article that was published in the Federalist in 2016 about his experiences.
I've got it here.
Oh, that's even bigger than this one. Thanks.
And
That's a picture of
we
Ed.
actually have a picture of that. This was after he completed airborne training and got his wings, which also that is a huge honor in the military.
Yeah.
I think it's a big deal.
So this is the article. It's a little bit long, but I think it's worth reading. I am a 3-time Army veteran of Afghanistan and a former law enforcement officer. I am also Black. My biological family has been to jail or prison at least once. I am the sole exception, unless you count the many times I've escorted others to jail. On my mom's side, the ones I grew up with, that's all 4 of my uncles and 2 younger brothers. On my dad's side, the one I met later in life, that's my dad, jailed once as a teenager for taking wood pallets from dumpster areas behind commercial buildings and selling them. At least 2 older half-brothers and the youngest, my stepbrother. Every one of them has experienced some degree of overreach with law enforcement officers they've encountered, from unlawful entry of residence to unlawful search and seizure to false charges to physical brutality. As a Black police officer, I found myself stuck in balancing act from the start, like walking a tightrope between 2 perennially warring foes. I belonged to both sides, but being in the middle put me at odds with each. One motivation for choosing to become a state law enforcement officer was the poignant memory of my younger brother being pistol whipped in the head by a local law enforcement and knocked unconscious after he refused an officer's demands in front of another officer to engage him in a fist fight. As the oldest brother, I was accustomed to being the responsible one and the one to call on when my brothers needed me. It was the first time I encountered a blatant wrong and injustice, and I felt utterly powerless to help remedy it. Who could I call? More police? I cannot articulate the depths at which that kind of wrong hurts a person. It is felt in the soul. My initial response and warning to my younger brothers was the same I see from so many today. If you don't break the law, you won't encounter the cops in the first place, and none of that will happen to you. I had little empathy. I didn't fully buy into racism at the time because I had been largely insulated from it thanks to well-integrated schools. So I believed instead that the odds were against me because I was a Christian and God was watching. What racism I did witness seemed largely avoidable by doing the right thing and was mostly from people raised on the Black side of town. My response was practical and it addressed the way things are, yet it simultaneously dismissed and therefore permitted the wrong in the way things are. I lived my own life by that same code. Be at least twice as clean as the other person in order to get the same treatment as that person. Be so clean that your reputation for it precedes you. That was normal survival for me. It was effective, but that doesn't make it right. For example, a few years ago, one of my uncles robbed a bank and got away. Later, he decided to turn himself in and sought me to escort him to do so. He was prepared to be justly punished for his crime, but he was also prepared to be unjustly punished via an officer's personal vengeance without my presence. When you live in this world where this is your common experience with the ambassadors of the law, it affects your incentive to respect and obey the laws, the same ones that don't protect or respect you. It is clear how this quickly devolves into a self-destructive cycle. Lost respect for the law increases the likelihood of breaking it and disrespecting its ambassadors, which increases the likelihood they will act harshly outside the scope of the justice system, which reaffirms and increases loss of respect for the law, and so downhill it goes. No members of my family expected justice, at least not at the first contact with the law. Similarly, I knew I was more likely to be treated harshly during encounters with law enforcement if I was on the Black side of town. This is the crux of the problem. It eludes many who have never witnessed this alternate but very real world, and therefore it is difficult for them to conceive. In fact, I told none of my biological family when I applied for the law enforcement job, and told none of them when I joined the academy. I knew what their reactions would be. When I graduated with top honors, he actually was the top cadet in his class and the first time a Black cadet had ever achieved that.
Wow.
I told my grandmother that I was a police officer. With no emotion in her face and in a tone of thinly veiled disappointment, almost under her breath, she replied, "I don't know why you want to do that for." My brother showed little reaction, but wanted to be happy for me. My mother was more ambivalent. I broke the news to my father by raiding his house one night with blinding lights of my patrol car flashing out in front when I banged on his door, demanding in my disguised voice that he come outside. I had intended to tackle him to the ground, and as soon as he opened the front door, but before he could realize it was me, but then I saw the look of defeat in his eye and in my stepmother's face, and as he opened the door, and I immediately lost heart and just hugged him instead. My adopted family, who is white, by contrast, was ecstatic and celebratory, along with my friends who did not grow up in the Black side of town. Friends bragged about my achievement to other friends, wanted to see my badge when we went out for eating or went to eat and paid for my meal. The party was on that side of my dual universe. I understood both reactions. In this side of the universe, uniformed officers are highly esteemed daily heroes out battling the dark forces on the behalf of the greater good. That is the version of law enforcement they regularly encounter. The prank night raid I pulled on my biological dad would never begin to succeed on my adoptive dad and family. I knew that, otherwise I would have pranked them too. If officers came beating on their door at night, my adoptive family would have been concerned but eager to open the door and welcome the officers in to figure out what the mix-up was. They would rest fully confident in their innocence and would quickly exonerate them before any harm came to them. My biological dad, despite being equally aware he had done nothing wrong, informed me later he had fully expected to be tackled to the ground, roughed up, and hauled off to jail before his innocence would prevail and exonerate him. This difference, difficult to articulate across sides, is what people miss when they make comparisons on what they see, often heard in statements that sound like, if they would just do what I do in that scenario, there would be no problem. I know this because I am guilty of it. It took me a long time to understand my biological family's point of view. I have worked hard to overcome the circumstances of my life and to succeed, and therefore am unlikely to turn around and act like a victim or perceive slights when there are none. Not only did I think the police overreach was a serious issue, I also did not experience racism. Unfortunately, my experiences in Army boot camp permanently removed my racism blinders forever. It was only the beginning of continual exposure to racism that slapped me in the face, no matter how hard I or other people around me wanted to deny it. I might be writing for the better part of this summer if I attempted to summarize all the accounts of racism and perceived racism I encountered between graduating high school and becoming a law enforcement officer and since. It reared its ugly head even during the law enforcement academy. I wish I had the time and space to share because it was all meaningful and illuminates the realities of the alternate world where racism thrives. A wonderfully integrated world I lived in prior to that point in my life was sadly a dream not yet realized. Walking around in my skin denies me the luxury of living in that world anymore. While racism happens primarily as headlines to those who are raised in a world of my adopted family, it happens to me as small, not uncommon, often subtle acts that directly affect the course of my daily life and life at large. It colors the lens through which I must view the world around me, for better or worse.
Very nice.
So that will kind of segue into next week where we talk about the criminal justice system. Quick prayer and then go. God, thank you for this group of people and thank you for bringing us together, opening our minds to see how you see people and how we need to do the work to make the world a better place for all people. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Contact him back, tell him thank you very much.
Yeah, okay.
So, do you know who's after you?
You are.
I am?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the 11th.
Yes.
Okay.